Ladies and gentlemen, to Logically Faithful. This is Calhoun Slice, where we are addressing culture redemptively and making sure we're dealing with suffering productively, using science, evidence, and anything else we get our hands on to give some reasons of what we believe and why we believe it, to make sure it gives us hope, meaning, and significance in our lives. And now we're dealing with the issue of global racism, as well as police brutality, Black Lives Matter, and things of that nature that are epidemic at this level, pun intended. I have with me a special friend, a brother in the faith, and a brilliant scholar, Ted Williams III. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Brother Swice. Appreciate you very much for having me.
You are a political science professor at Wright College, or were, actually right now, yeah. Chicago State University, currently chairman of the Social Sciences Department at Kennedy King College. You hold degrees from the University of Chicago, Rutgers University, and you were the former host of WYCC-PBS television series of professors, which I was privileged to be on a couple times. You are an author. You've written some significant books on the issue of race and relations and faith. You're also, the most important thing, is a father and a husband to Roslyn, and honestly, Roslyn's your wife, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
Children, right? Gabriel, me as a Ted.
Make sure that distinction is clear, you know?
Yeah, that would be help. I'm so glad to have you on. You are an inspiration, and I'm always learning from your insights. So let's go ahead and get started on this. We need to think clearly on this issue. How do you feel, and how do you deal right now with the current situation of that's growing at epidemic levels?
So one of the things that I have been fortunate enough to do with my academic work is to use the artistic gifts that I have been given to create art that educates, entertains, and inspires. And so one of the pieces that I did recently is a piece called 1619, The Journey of the People, which is a 2-hour musical production that we'll be doing again on Juneteenth over the internet and television stations. And I am very convinced that America, our short memory, collectively, is really problematic when we deal with issues of race, or when we deal with really issues of anything. So what we've tried to do is take the history and tell the history in a fun, musical, memorable way to kind of show us how we got here. And I think if you don't do that, if you don't take a step backwards to think about how we got here, I think we'll miss the opportunity that we have to correct our society, that this current crisis that is represented by the George Floyd death and all of the conversations about race that have been brought up by that death have engendered. And so we don't want to miss that opportunity. And so if we don't understand the past, we're bound to repeat our mistakes of the past. And so really this George Floyd, really, I don't know, this fire that's brewing here, this has been 400 years in the making. And we are not going to get out of this until we begin to address the dichotomy that exists in this great land. This is a great country, brother. This is a wonderful country. This is a country that has provided opportunity for so many people. This is my home. This is your home. This is all I've ever known. I know you are more international than I am, and you've lived other places in Jordan and that sort of thing. I've never lived in another country. I've been to other countries, I've never lived in another country. This is my home. This is all I know. This is my land. I'm not going anywhere. My grandfather fought in the Korean War. You know, my ancestors before that fought in World War I. And if you think about what has happened, is that this question of citizenship and patriotism is really a false question, because those people who look like me have built this country with blood, sweat, and tears, and we're invested here. We're not going anywhere. So we've got to figure out how to deal with this together, because on the one hand, America's beautiful and it's wonderful, and it's a land of opportunity and equality for all, but there is a dichotomy, there's another side to America that we like to ignore and drive through as quickly as possible. When you're driving through a beautiful city like Chicago, you go from the airport, you see the wonderful parts of the town, you go downtown, then you get through you got to drive through scary parts. Those scary parts are this other side of America, where millions of people live in conditions that are institutional, that are collective, that are problematic. And that to me is what we ought to be talking about. How do we make America great, not again, but great for all people?
Okay, well said, brother. All right, so as we normally get into our conversations, we really push each other. And you challenge me in many ways. So let me go ahead and return the favor.
Sure.
All right. So we have right now the over 8 minutes and was it 30 some seconds that the officer had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, and he ended up dying through sustained injuries later, which was horrible and a severe and obvious case of brutality that's happened across the board in many places and been repeated constantly. We're not going to minimize that, but I do want to discuss some issues in a broader sense on racism and police brutality, the Black community, and the systemic racism and the institutional racism that many are saying that's happening, as well as Black Lives Matter, the very institution and the organization itself. So let me go ahead and raise some of the objections that are being raised.
All right.
All right. So many conservative Christians, evangelical Christians, and some others have expressed some significant concerns regarding the terms institutional or systemic racism across the board in the United States and the Western countries as well. Can you give us some specific examples of institutional or systemic racism that's happening across the board? We're not talking about incidental things that happen like what happened with Floyd and others. We're talking about on an institutional or government level happening now or within the last decade that the movement is saying we need to address, we need to deal with, which I think we do need to address and deal with. But where specifically is it happening so we can articulate ourselves and focus ourselves on our energies and deal with that?
Well, brother, with all due respect, I have to reject your premise off the bat. I have to reject part of the question. Your question suggests that we should not talk about systemic racism, institutional racism, unless we're talking about the last decade. I think is what you sort of wanted to couch it in that. You are a scholar. I teach politics, public policy. The last decade is a blip in the history of America. The United States of America was founded on the notion on paper that all men were created equal and in principle on racial subjugation. We cannot, as scholars, as historians, look at the past decade and have the conversation there. Brother, I am very well versed in this, in the same sort of the same kind of intellectual and academic research around family issues and what has happened to the American family and those sorts of things that many of my conservative brothers and sisters are very concerned about, as am I in many ways. You cannot have that conversation with just the past decade. You have to look at that conversation over 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 100 years, and look at what happens culturally, what happened in public policy, same thing. So 1619, 250 years of chattel slavery, right? In which people were dehumanized, not allowed to vote, not allowed to read, not allowed to marry, not allowed to have any sort of semblance of equality in this country, 250 years. Then that's Emancipation Proclamation 1863. It's not until 1960s, 1963, 1965, 1968, that the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Voting Rights Act passed, the Housing Rights Act was passed. So we did 100 years of Jim Crow segregation and legally sanctioned terror, where lynching was problematic and consistent throughout the South. Literally, when you talk about terrorist organizations, the KKK is 10 times more dangerous to America, 1,000 times more dangerous to America than Al-Qaeda ever has been or ever will be. So this is terrorism. So now we're into the 1960s, bro. My father was born in the 1950s. My mother was born in the 1950s. So when my parents were born, they did not even have the federally protected right to vote. We look at this public policy, and then we go, well, can't we all just get along? Why can't people just pick themselves up by their bootstraps? Brother, I used to think that way too. One of the beautiful things about our conversations, I used to be a lot more conservative leaning than I am now. And unfortunately, I believed as a person of faith and as a person from a middle class background that all we had to do was just pick ourselves up, and because I've had many opportunities, but that does not. And I will quote my brother, one of my people that I respect, who I've never met personally, Paul Robeson, who was a great actor and singer and activist and author. He said that I will never allow my personal success to negate the institutional struggles and the challenges that affect 40 million other people. And so, yes, I have been blessed. Yes, I went to good schools. Yes, my father owned businesses, and I'm very proud of that. But that does not negate the suffering of 40 million people in this nation. And if you say maybe it ain't 40, maybe it's 30, maybe it's 20, I'm suggesting once again that we have generations of public policy to deny access to people. I'm gonna give you a couple specifics in a second. But what I want you to realize, and what I tell people all the time, is that was just over 50 years ago.
Right.
We're not talking 200 years ago. We're talking about when my parents were born. They could not vote legally at the federal level. Do you understand how significant that is? I'm 43 years old. This is not ancient history. This is right now. Mm-hmm. And so the wealth, African Americans have 1/10, listen to me, 1/10 the wealth of European Americans in this country. 1/10. In the state of Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed, they're talking about all this police brutality issue. 75% of white Minnesota residents own their own homes. Only 25% of African Americans in that state own their own homes. We know that home ownership is the key to wealth in American society, right, and we do not have it. The GI Bill after World War II gave white Americans the opportunity to build wealth in communities. And so you're talking 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, people are building wealth. Those homes are appreciating in value. Then they use that wealth to pay for college or to buy another home. Right. African Americans were denied access to those things. So what I'm saying is, African Americans are the equivalent almost of first generation immigrants. Even though we've been here for 400 years, economically and financially, which is what matters the most in America, the land of the free, home of the brave, brother and sister. You and I both know that very well. It's the capitalist system. In that way, we are so far behind. We are the equivalent of a first generation immigrant community. And I'm not using that as an excuse. I'm saying that as reality. And yes, we can fight. And yes, we are building. And yes, there's opportunity. And yes, there has been progress. And praise God for that progress. But you would literally have to be blind to drive around this country and not notice the vast disparities. And those disparities have been historic. They have been institutional, they have been systematic, and they have been purposeful. And I think now we're just starting to talk about it, which I think is a wonderful thing.
It's a wonderful thing. You're right. And thank you for pointing that out. It would be ludicrous and absurd to ignore the systemic and institutional racism at many levels throughout the history of the country. And those things do cause reactions and chemical chain reactions on people on an individual and a global scale as well. However, institutions right now are spending millions and plugging in millions of dollars trying to help enumerate these kinds of things. So what specifically would you recommend, in what specific areas, for example, the housing market or the family market, what areas have systemic and institutional racism now that we can address?
Public schools.
What is it?
The state of Illinois, the state we live in, ranks 48 out of 50 in terms of educational equality, 48 out of 50. The state of Illinois is funded, the schools are funded through the property tax structure. That property tax structure says that if a community has the homes are of more value in that community, then those homes will get more property tax revenue that goes to the schools.
Of course, that makes sense, okay? Yes. Mm-hmm.
What it does is, it literally incentivizes a gap between the wealthy and the poor. And so rather than providing more help for the students that need the most, more help for communities that have suffered historically from redlining, which by the way, continues today very heavily. I hosted a panel, brother, and I want you to hear this clearly. This ain't a black thing. I hosted a panel this weekend of 6 white scholars, 6, who are more well-versed in some of the stuff than I am about the institutional issues. This is not ancient history. This is not sort of black people making this up.
Right.
One of my friends who is is a director of urban studies at Elmhurst College, name is Dr. Connie Mixon, dropped the fact that we were talking the other day that private capital and investment in the city of Chicago is 9 times more likely to go to wealthy or white people in the city than it is to go to people who are poor or who are minority. And
Let me pause here for a moment. And I call you brother because you are a brother in the faith, but is it this classism, not necessarily racism per se? Expand on that objection.
Well, I would love if it were just classism and not racism, but you have to understand that in America, it has always been about race. Do you realize that in 1924, the state of Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, in which they wanted to make clear what it was to be black and what it was to be white? And they said that if you have 1 drop of black blood, then you cannot be a full citizen and you cannot have equal rights in the state of Virginia. Do you realize that up until the 1950s and 60s, you couldn't even get married interracially in this country? I would love, listen to me carefully, I am not a person that really loves my race. I've written about it. I think I don't. I just want to be a person. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I am a Christian. I love to play sports. I don't want to talk about race all day. I would love to just talk about class, but that would be lying about American history. It would be lying about American culture. Why
again, you're going historical on me. I'm looking for specific current examples so we can help address some of the objections to deal with that. That's what I'm trying to
I told you about the education system that still exists, that issue today. I told you about the phenomenal wealth disparity that exists, the phenomenal home ownership disparity that exists as well. I have told you about, listen, if you drive through the city of Chicago, you go to the Gold Coast. The majority of people that live in the Gold Coast and the nice parts of the community don't look like me. If you drive to Inglewood, the majority of people that live in Inglewood look like me. And so I mean, the data is abound, bro. I mean, the data is overwhelming.
That leads then to the reason that we actually discussed this video, and you also pinpointed this later on. You said there are 2 primary reasons. One, that the African-American community is either there's something wrong with them sociologically, financially, spiritually. Something's wrong with that community that needs to pick itself up by its bootstraps. Or there's an institutional type of societal systemic issue that's pressing this community down. Those seem to be 2 dichotomy points of view. And I indicated to you that, isn't that a false dichotomy? Because don't you take what Hegel talked about? You have the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis. Isn't there something to the truth between both of these issues? Let me give you some statistics to point this out and help me to address this and some of the objections to this. The Brookings Institute, for example, pointed out in 1965, 24% of Black infants were born to single mothers. Now the rate has jumped to 64 to 85% in certain areas. Crime rates, 70%. Right now, I'm looking in Chicago alone, are born to unwed mothers or multiple mothers in different communities. 2014, African Americans constitute 2.3 million of the 34% of the 6.8 million correctional problem in the city. We're talking about the prison system. Why is that? Why are African Americans 5 times higher rates of being incarcerated than whites? Now you gave us the 2 reasons. One, that there's a problem with the culture itself, or the other is systemic racism. Isn't there a combination between the 2 that we can address as scholars, as Christians, and deal with this issue rather than convolute it?
I mean, there's so many places to start on this thing. I'm going to start with the crime issue.
All right.
You are my brother. You are my friend. I am offended that people with high levels of intellect cannot see the correlation between crime and poverty. I don't understand that. If you leave the United States, you go to Colombia, you go to Brazil, you go to the UK, anywhere you go around the world, crime and poverty are correlated. Dr. King said that crime is environmental, it is not racial. When you find people of color who are in communities where they have good housing and they have good schools and they have good families, they are not committing crimes. When you see the people who are looting, by the way, which there were a number of people who are not African American who are looting, I know there's a stereotype about that as well, but when you see people who are looting and they were breaking into these are not people who are middle class. These are not people who have had opportunities. These are not people who've gone to school. These are people who are literally saying, I have nothing to lose. If I get arrested for looting because I went and stole $100 worth of sneakers, so be it. That, my friend, is a American problem. And the challenge that upsets me more than anything is that Americans and American Christians are so selfish that they can look at cities like Chicago burning and say, well, look at those people. Man, I wish they would pick it up because that's not my problem. I don't have anything to do with that. As long as I live on the right side of town and on the right block, it's okay. We are only as strong as our weakest link. And until America realizes that, we're going to face the same fate as Rome. You cannot, as Dr. King said, continue to have a first-class country with second-class citizens. This is our collective problem. The crime rate in the city of Chicago among African Americans is our collective problem. I will not, as a friend or as a fellow Christian, blame these communities for the high levels of crime. You work in the community. You know what these kids are dealing with. You know where they're coming from. You know that most of these crimes these crimes have to do with a lack of resources and education and exposure to good culture. Now, having said all that, right, as a person who's a leader in the African American community, of course I'm going to tell people to do better and to fight better and to be their best selves and to not give in to what people, of course I'm going to do that, but I'm not going to let America off the hook. Let me talk to you about the problem of fatherless homes.
Let me pause up for a moment. The fatherhood issue and the dropout rates of young urban men and young black men in urban schools. These rates are staggeringly high, brother. It's troubling to me. When I see my students, for example, the vast majority of them at Olive Harvey College, who I deeply love and learn a lot from, come from families that do not have a father in the home or a father who's absent from the home. So you're saying you're linking this to the poverty issue?
Let me explain to you about the fatherless issue.
Sure, go for it.
70% of African-American children grow up without a father in the home. This is a huge American problem. By the way, the numbers for white Americans, which we don't talk about very often, those have gone up drastically since the 60s too, okay? And there have been 5 major historic factors that have contributed to what we're seeing here, okay? I'm gonna talk about a few of them.
Go for it.
First of all, slavery historically decimated the structure of the black family. You can say that in the 60s that there were higher rates and that sort of thing, and that is true, but what you must understand is that the African-American family has been walking around with a broken leg and a limp for hundreds of years. There's no family community in America where women make more money than men do, where women are more educated than men are. Why is that? Is there something morally flawed about black men? That's the question. That's why I gave you only 2 propositions, friend. Either there is institutional injustice going on or black people are lazy and they're immoral. And I mean, if you want to believe that, you're more than welcome to. I mean, I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's not the case. I like to consider myself one piece of that evidence, plus my entire family, plus large chunks of my community, plus many, many thousands of other African Americans I've known throughout my lifetime. But there are only 2 issues there. Because either you put it on the individual, which Americans like to do, or you understand that we have a collective problem. So the first thing is the issue of slavery. The second thing is this issue, and we saw this in slavery obviously impacted us uniquely. The sexual revolution. This is where I'll throw my conservative roots at you, bro. The sexual revolution and the changing of sort of the family structure in this way in terms of sexuality was detrimental to America as a whole and more detrimental to African Americans. When white Americans get a cold, black Americans get pneumonia. And so our adoption of American standards of sexuality had a deleterious impact on our families. That's number 2. I'm gonna give you 5, give me a second. Number 3, mass incarceration. What you must understand is that the United States of America has more people in jail than any other country in the world. The second largest levels of incarceration are in China. There are 2 times as many people in America in jail as in China, and there are 1 billion people in China. What has happened? African Americans were literally ripped out of their homes. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody's in jail is innocent. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I am suggesting is that when you look at large numbers of the movement from the 1960s, those numbers have shot. All you just look at the graph. We did not have the mass incarceration phenomenon prior to the civil rights movement. The mass incarceration phenomenon pulled men out of Black communities heavily for various crimes. For instance, if you look at the disparity between the sentencing someone gets for crack cocaine and powder cocaine used more in white affluent communities, crack cocaine used more in poor Black communities, you would get 2 times the amount of jail time for the same crime. African Americans use drugs at the same rates as everyone else. Some data shows that we use drugs less than white Americans and go to jail at much higher rates. I know this anecdotally because I have lived in all kinds of communities. I've lived in the all Black community. I live in all white communities. I lived in New Jersey, where I had a Vietnamese, Puerto Rican, Asian, and a white roommate in 3 years, okay? I mean, I am well versed in, I think, American culture in that way. And let me tell you something. The Black people I know do not use drugs more than white people that I know, okay? They just don't at higher rates. Anecdotally, I can say that to be true. So that's the second thing. Welfare policies in the 1960s. This is where I will agree with conservatives who suggest that welfare policies in the 60s were problematic. They were detrimental. They pushed men out of the home, saying that if a man was in the home, a woman could not get her benefits. This helped to push men out of the home in the 1960s and 70s. That's number 3. Number 4, no-fault divorce in the 1970s and 80s. This had an impact on all American families. All American families suffer from it. Once again, white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And so we've got welfare, slavery, mass incarceration, no-fault divorce laws, and the sexual revolution. You put those 5 together, and you have a perfect storm of broken families, a perfect storm that creates situations of fatherlessness. And yes, that is a huge issue. Many liberal people have been talking about this issue. My God, I want to see Black fathers in the home. My God, I want to tell every Black man that I work with, that I'm doing ministry with, that I'm dealing with in school, that they need to stay with their families and stay with their kids and love their families. That is what Black leadership is teaching. But you got to understand, bro, I am literally, and all those leaders are literally the equivalent of someone on the Titanic with a glue gun. And we're running around the ship trying to patch up the holes.
Wow, this is powerful stuff. And now with the mass protests and the people gathering together to bring this issue to the forefront of the eyes of white America or the world per se. I see things happening in London right now and even in Lebanon. Hopefully some changes will be significantly made, because it breaks my heart to see these types of things happen for people based on their culture and their race and the color of their skin. It disgusts me, actually, to see that happening. So thank you for bringing those major points out and expressing those. Let's shift the conversation a little bit. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. It bothers me a lot when I hear people say, well, all lives matter. Well, I'm a big proponent of the pro-life cause, as I know you're pro-life yourself, but you're shifting some areas. Maybe we'll find some redemption there for you. But when we say that fetus lives matter, we don't say, but other lives matter. No, we can focus on that. So why can't we say Black lives matter too? It troubles me when people just...
You know what, I love your heart on that. I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, I think that in the initial early stages of this movement, there was conversation. I probably was part of that conversation to suggest, hey, let's all talk about, the issue in a universal way, get more support. Let's talk about everybody's life should matter, and we should have, support for that. But what we've come to realize over the last couple of years is that this is a political posturing position to suggest that saying Black Lives Matter is some kind of radical statement. I heard a comedian say the other day, and I thought it was hilarious. He said, we're not saying that Black lives matter more. We're not saying that Black lives matter only. We're not saying Black lives matter. Can we just say that they exist? He was literally arguing what's less than matter. Like, Black lives exist. Black lives are here. Can we agree with that? I mean, what is the big controversy? And I think, once again, America has collective amnesia. America does not like self-reflection. America is like what the Bible says, the man who looks in the mirror and forgets what he looks like. Because America does not want to examine itself. It is all or nothing. Either you love this country and you love the troops, or you hate this country and you hate the troops. And to your point, in terms of dichotomies, I will not accept that. It is quite possible, and I would argue it is patriotic to criticize the country to make it better for all people. If we criticize and we change, maybe in 100 years, bro, maybe in 100 years, Dr. King's dream will really be true.
Okay.
Maybe in 100 years, we can all be judged for the color of the content of our character, and not just color of our skin. And when you look at the police brutality issue,
I want to get there, but let's focus on the Black Lives Matter now. Now, Black Lives Matter movement is different than the actual term Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement has taken under some heavy hitting nowadays, ideologically speaking. For example, they claim that police brutality is systemic across the board. They also claim that they're very big on what's called Black Power, promoting homosexuality, transgenderism, completely ignoring the fatherhood or fatherless issue of the Black society. What do you say about the Black Lives Matter movement itself? Not necessarily the idea that Black Lives Matter. Do you have, for Christians who are struggling to support the progressive nature of that movement with their Christian faith, help us to connect the dots there.
My friend, I think that, not to throw too much shade here, but part of the reason why even conservative African Americans are willing to embrace movements that don't align with all of their ideology and all of their theology is because the other side does not want to even say that Black Lives Matter. And so what you find is that people don't care about the history of the Black Lives Matter movement. They don't care about what the Black Lives Matter movement does behind closed doors. At the end of the day, we have all galvanized behind this idea. And so, yes, there are going to be problems, but in the same way that the conservatives ignored the myriad problems that exist with our current president, we have ignored things that we may have disagreement on for a larger goal. I know plenty of African Americans who don't care whether Joe Biden is caught in a hotel smoking crack with 5 prostitutes. They're still going to vote for him over Donald Trump because of what he represents. And I think when it comes to this movement, bro, you're not going to get me to bash them at all. I mean, you're just not, because the issues are bigger than them. And character assassination has been used historically in this country for all groups, not just African Americans, but definitely for African Americans. When you see what they did with Dr. King and what they did with the Black Panther Party, this is history. So you're not going to get me to engage in character assassination.
Well, we're not I'm trying not to character assassinate anybody. I'm just trying to get some perspective on the the movement itself.
Yeah, I just don't think. I think that honestly, that's immaterial for people. Okay. Honestly.
Let's talk about trying to wrap this up here to honor your time as well. The white privilege. Let's talk about that a little bit and how people of color can address this issue.
I would tell people, I spent an hour and a half talking to people who are more well-versed in white privilege than me. Okay. There's 6 white American scholars and thinkers who convinced me more of white privilege than I even believed in before we began. So I think you guys should go check out my Facebook page. I've got a great conversation for just this week on this. Check them out. Go read Tim Weiss. Go read a lot of people who have been making these cases more than me. I don't even honestly think it's me as a Black person to sit and cry about white privilege. I mean, I'm trying to survive like everyone else. I'm trying to make sure I have the best family and that sort of thing. The privilege in this culture is obvious, but for me, the onus is on people who don't look like me to actually express that, because I just think it's very obvious.
Oh, fair enough. Let's talk, give me some thoughts regarding the looting and that's happening in specifically in our community. I have a couple of family members whose stores were decimated in that area. I've seen families drive up with vans, filling them up with things from grocery stores and others. I haven't just seen the thug doing this. I've seen families looting. Sure. Area. Discuss the looting issue a little bit for us, because I see people affected by it on a personal level.
Looting is bad. Would you like for me to condemn looting? Is that let me explain this, okay? I mean, what do you want to say? Dr. King said that riots are the language of the unheard. So the riots don't come out of thin air. You know, when families are out looting, that says something about our society, okay? My family would not be looting. Most of my other family, and I ain't gonna lie, I probably have one cousin here and there between all of the many people that I'm in my family. I've got many people in my family, but I may have a person or so out there that may have done that. The truth is that these issues, folks, are larger societal issues. I don't support lawlessness. I shouldn't have to argue that I don't support
No,
lawlessness.
but here's the problem as a philosopher, and you as a scholar know, there's a fine line between explaining something and excusing it or justifying it. And sometimes the line flips between the two. Like, this is what happened. This is why my family's this way. This is why we have crime issues. This is why we have poverty. Well, yeah, but does that excuse, or how do you connect the dots there or not connect them?
People are able to hold two ideas in their mind at the same time. I forget which philosopher said that if you can't do that, then there's something wrong with you.
William James.
Yeah. Said that you can hold two ideas in your mind. I can understand rioting. Dr. King can understand rioting. Black activists and leaders can understand rioting and not condone it, and call the police on them, which we did, and go and clean up the stuff, which we did, and go and tell people to stop, which we did, and yet still understand the pain and the anger and the frustration and the hopelessness that drives it. I, in no way, my brother, any more than as we talked about the parable of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, and in no way condoning rioting any more than he was condoning adultery by not judging her or casting the first stone or telling them not to. He understood the challenges. We had a great theological conversation about this, but he still held her to a higher standard, held her to the law. Of course, looters should go to jail. Duh. Of course they should. They're tearing up our communities. But I'm not going to sit here and say that when we have a city and a nation that has been comfortable with inequality, comfortable with second-class citizenship, comfortable with community after community just struggling, and gang violence and crime, and doesn't care, you're going to think that I'm going to condemn them? And Walmart is a multi-billion-dollar company, and Amazon is a multi-billion-dollar company that has closed 30% of American stores in the last 10 years and doesn't pay any taxes. And you think I'm going to go, yes, Walmart, I hope you guys didn't lose anything. I know you guys have insurance, but I hope you didn't lose. Are you kidding me? These people have no power. They have no power. They looted Walmart. What about the people who looted the stimulus plan, the PPP plan, where corporations made millions of dollars off of the stimulus, and you've got people who are struggling who got one check for $1,200 2 months ago? I don't want to be lectured on crime in a country where the president brags about not paying taxes, where the president brags about sexually abusing women. I don't want to be lectured on lawlessness. I don't support looting at all, but I certainly don't support raping and robbing and pillaging people the way the big corporations do in this country as well. And that, my friend, if that was an equal conversation, we would have somewhere to talk, but come on now. People don't want to have an equal conversation. They want to moralize.
Hey, Ted, why don't you tell us what you really think about that?
I'm sorry, I get quite.
All right, let's go ahead and conclude this with a question, or not a question, but a suggestion for moving forward. What can we do as a country, as a people, as a group, as organizations, and finally, most importantly, as a church, spiritually, individually, corporately, to make this a better and take this level and move it to the next one?
Sure. We have to listen. There's a lot of pain in this country. Can't be offended when people share pain. It doesn't make all pain right, but just as you and I have had personal conversations about this, people want to be heard. That's number one. Number two, we have to deliberately, overtly, unapologetically address the clear racial, ethnic, income disparities that exist in this country. We cannot be comfortable in them. We cannot be apologetic about dealing with them. We cannot be afraid to offend until all of Chicago has a basic level of sustenance, a basic level of opportunity. When people are not scrambling to get out of schools in certain areas because they're terrified of what's going to happen. Most people, bro, will not send their kids to most Chicago public schools. Why is that? That's an American problem. Until we have that, so I specifically, I mean, I teach public, I mean, my background's in public policy. So specifically, you know, I think in many ways, and I know that when I say certain things, it might offend people, but we ought to begin to have the conversations about reparations. And what does that look like, right? And I'm not, you know, I know people, oh my goodness, I know this becomes a big thing. Oh my gosh, reparations, da, 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 da. But the GI Bill, the income disparities, the wealth gap, the fact that companies like Chase Manhattan made part of their money off of slavery and have apologized about it. The fact that people in the NFL cannot even peacefully protest without offending people. And then now the NFL comes out and apologizes about that 4 years later, but what about all the damage that was done in those 4 years? We need restitution for those things. And what does that look like, bro? We could have a long conversation. I'm not even trying to get overly partisan in that. But what I am saying is that even as a Christian community, the idea of restitution and reparations is a biblical idea. And we ought to be thinking about how can we deal with what has historically been wronged. And history matters. I want to start back at the very beginning of our conversation. I can tell you in the last decade of the mortgage discrimination, those sorts of things. I've got studies that show that mortgage discrimination is still going on across the country, that schools are still segregated, all those things are fine. But when you look at history has got us in this place. And so until we go back and deal with that, 50 years I'm talking about, it's not a long time. That's not a long time at all. We can't expect people to automatically heal from 400 years of really post-traumatic stress disorder. African Americans are hurting and are struggling in this country, not just physically, economically, socially, but I would say psychologically, because there have been years and years and years of being told that Black lives do not matter. And so the issues are multifaceted. There are no simple solutions. I am so happy that we're having these conversations now.
Now, ground this for us now as we land this plane in the most important thing to you, the transcendent in Christ, in your relationship with God. How does our faith help us move this forward?
Yeah, so being a Christian, being a minister, being a professor, right. My faith is the most important thing to me in my life. It gives me the spirit to be able to have conversations. It gives me the spirit to not cast all police officers or all people who look, different from me into one sort of boat. It gives me the spirit to have the strength and just to have, as one of your favorite people, Barack Obama said, the audacity of hope. Actually, his pastor, probably even more of your favorite person, Jeremiah Wright, said it. the audacity of hope.
Yeah.
It is audacious to have hope when it's dark. It's audacious to have, and that's what our faith does, bro. And so it gives me hope. It gave Dr. King hope. It gave the civil rights leaders hope. It gave SCLC hope when they were marching and there were dogs and water hoses, and it'll give us the same hope. I am a believer. I went to a march last week in Chicago. I went to a march led by the faith community because I was excited about that, because I know that for me, if we don't ground this in a larger theological story, then our human flesh takes over. And what does our human flesh do? We hate each other, we fight each other, we beat each other. I don't want to be a part of that. I'm about love because God's about love. God's also about justice. And we cannot separate those two from the God that we serve. And so our faith, to me, is our source of hope, love, patience, joy. But it doesn't mean that we ignore what is obvious, that we don't fight with the right spirit, but that we don't still fight.
Amen to that. Well, thank you, brother. It's been a privilege to have you. And of course, you're always full of wisdom and insights. So, and our faith glues us together and our friendship continues to grow. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you.
I appreciate you very much. And I want to say this in closing. I respect you. We don't always agree. We don't agree on a bunch of stuff, and that's fine. And I know your ideological leanings, you know mine, right? But you are a reflective person. You are a person that says, yes, I believe this, but I'm willing to take a step back and just think. We need more people like you who are willing to do that. because that is what's missing so greatly in the society. We are all sort of set in our own ways. And I've changed in the last 20 years, and guess what? I may change again 20 years from now, and that's okay. But you are fostering conversation. You're fostering an inquisitive spirit, and one that's grounded in faith. And I love it, and I appreciate you for it. I really do. Once again, we do not agree on everything,
No.
and that's okay, because this is what is going to heal our country. And when people are too prideful or ignorant to engage in these discussions, that's what scares me. Not this, but that. And I wish and pray that you will continue on these things and continue in the work that you're doing. And I wish you many blessings in it, because you're seeking wisdom and knowledge. And we might come to different conclusions, but you're seeking it. And I love you for it, man. I really, really do. And I respect you for it, and I support you for it. And I'm gonna keep fighting you on certain things, but it's okay. I don't agree with my wife on everything. I don't agree with my brother on everything. That's okay. But I love the fact that you are pushing forward to learn. So thank you for this, and let us continue to fight the good fight.
Thank you, brother. Those words mean a lot, especially coming from you. God bless you.
God bless you too. Take care.